Hello and welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, to this very timely talk at CEFTUS and with CEFTUS. I am Yavuz Baydar, the editor of Ahval News Online, an independent news site in 3 languages, Turkish, English, and Arabic on Turkey. We are most certainly at a very critical juncture in modern history, scarred by the massive COVID epidemic and growing economic concerns globally last year. We have been also witnessing a very dramatic series of events at the heart of the United States of America. The elections last November in America brought about a deep seismic change, shifting the power from Donald Trump and the Republicans and over to Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Democrats. What we have seen since early November has been a profound dismay, protests, and escalating tension, constantly escalating tension in the leading power of the family of democracies. In a series of astonishing moves, Mr. Trump defied the election results and culminated the national tension by challenging the election results, the truth. And on the eve of the transition of power, recently, he moved ahead in what many sees as the direct incitement of violence against one of the fortresses, symbols of the very democracy and power he represents, and he was supposed to protect by his oath. Capitol was assaulted by a huge mob, vandalized, and elected politicians that were on the verge of losing their lives. And lives were lost also. The riots that led to an insurrection marks a defining moment in American history, with a second impeachment launched over the president and with yet unknown consequences in politics and society. Now, as we follow the developments, the world tensely waits for the inauguration ceremony on January 20th, by which Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will take over the power from a spiteful president, and we will see a new era to unfold and take shape before our eyes. Tonight, we are gathered to hold a lens just on that part. The title of the talk is What Comes After Populism? The Impact of Capitol Riots on United States, Turkish, and world politics. We should also, needless to say, add regional politics where Turkey is based. Therewith, I welcome Dr. Aykan Erdemir, the speaker of this session. Welcome, Aykan.
Thank you for having me.
Let me introduce Aykan briefly before I leave the word to him. Dr. Aykan Erdemir is currently Senior Director of the think tank Foundation of Defense of Democracies, in short FDD, Turkey program. FDD is based in Washington, D.C. He's based there, the epicenter of the events, that is the stage of the subject he will tonight talk about. He's a former member of the Turkish parliament from 2011 to 2015 as part of the CHP, the Secular People's, the Republican People's Party. And he served also in the EU-Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee in the Parliament and EU Harmonization Committee and Ad hoc Parliamentary Committee on the IT sector and the Internet. As an outspoken defender of pluralism, minority rights, and religious freedoms in the Middle East, Aykan has been at the forefront of the struggle against religious persecution, hate crimes, and hate speech in Turkey. He's a founding member of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion and Belief, and a drafter of and signatory to the Oslo Charter of Freedom for Freedom of Religion and Belief, as well as signatory legislator to the London Declaration of Combating Anti-Semitism. Before also I give the floor to Aykan, let me brief you on some minor technical aspects. The entire session will be 90 minutes, 1 hour and a half. The talk will be about 45 to 50 minutes approximately, whereafter we will be shifting over to the next part, to Q&A session. Please send your questions in writing, and at the end of the whole talk, whole session, before we finalize, we will take a family photo. And those who do not want to be in the photo, please shut down your cameras at the end. So, Aykan, let's begin. Let's begin with the riots that I talked about. What has been the impact of the Capitol riots? It's a developing story, I know, but what will be the impact on the political spectrum in America, and how will it shape the future of Republican Party and the Biden administration's policies, as well as the society in general?
So in the run-up to Capitol Hill riots, President Trump could have taken two very different paths following his election defeat. The first path, which could have started even in the lead up to the election, was to use his last period in office to emphasize his wins, his successes, to boost his legacy, and after losing the election, concede defeat. So that was one strategy he didn't prefer. The second path, which is the one that brought us to the Capitol riots, was to escalate tensions further, to polarize the electorate further, resist election results, refuse to concede, and thereby bring this escalation all the way to the use of violence for political means. Now, one could argue that the first strategy was a better strategy for the day after, if he wanted to continue his political ambitions, if he wanted to sustain Trumpism after Trump in office. And the second one, and which is now what I will go into, the second strategy comes with various risks, not just to Trump as an individual, but also Trumpism as a populist ideology. Now, when I say a populist ideology, just a very short footnote is important here. So when I use the term populism, what do I really mean by it? You know, in today's world, this is a pejorative word for the most part. Rarely a leader self-identifies as a populist. And often and incorrectly, we equate populism just with the far right. Although we know that populism can come in different shades. There can be left populist or right populist currents and movements and leaders. Ultimately, this is what's called a thin ideology, a light ideology, as opposed to thick ideologies of fascism, Nazism, which are quite well articulated, formulated, which basically builds on the distinction between the good people, the masses, versus the corrupt elite. And of course, there are all sorts of problems with this dichotomy. One novel I strongly would like to recommend was what German author Hans Fallada wrote back in 1947, Jeder stirbt für sich allein, which was only translated into English in 2009 as Every Man Dies Alone. This is a very important novel, in my opinion, which is a fictionalized account of a working class couple, Otto and Elise Hampel, who had only elementary school training and the husband was only a factory worker. And they wrote postcards to resist Nazism at a time when Professor Heidegger was supporting Nazism. So, you know, it's difficult to distinguish always who has the upper hand in terms of having the moral high ground. Certainly the masses were behind Nazism at a time when also many of the elites were behind Nazism, whereas we had this working class couple, you know, a rare exception to the rest of the German public. So let me end the populism debate there, but ultimately what brings most populists together is this sense of anti-diversity, anti-cosmopolitanism, anti-elitism, There are strong majoritarian tendencies, and often populism comes with charismatic leaders, such as Donald Trump. And interestingly, many of these charismatic leaders themselves belong to the economic elite, meaning they're rarely from the 99%, the so-called 99%. They're often a member of the top 1% economically. And often populism can be hybrid. In the Turkish case, it can combine Islamism with populism. And in the US case, in this latest reiteration, it combined populism with white supremacy. So now let's come back to the Capitol riots. So that's where we see almost all of this manifested. So it was definitely a hybrid riot. It involved people, from quite different backgrounds, but heavily under the influence of conspiracy theories, disinformation, various supremacist, anti-Semitic ideas, prejudices, violent, quite majoritarian, and believed in the ultimate goodness of the people, the masses, an imagined masses versus an imagined narrow, corrupt elite. Now, we all know the consequences, the immediate consequences in terms of destruction to the Congress and the loss of life. But what is more significant at this point is what comes after, meaning what will be the implications. And that's what Yavuz's question, I think, allude to. So first of all, I would like to argue that Trump's day after is now radically different from before Capitol riots. This event not only boosted the ranks of anti-Trump Republicans, because we know that with the exception of, let's say, some early defectors who were never Trumpers within the Republican Party in the 2016 elections, and some more who supported other candidates in the 2020 elections, the bulk of elected Republican officials, at least for tactical reasons, stayed with Trump, did not want to cross him because they didn't want to basically be destroyed by the populist wave, which is extremely effective when you think about US politics at the level of primaries, at the local level. This could be really politically lethal, which is now also, which we need to add physically dangerous for an elected Republican official to resist these populist waves. But following Capitol riots, we have seen a greater willingness to speak up. We have seen this most concretely in the latest impeachment, the second impeachment vote. There were 10 Republican representatives who broke ranks, crossed party lines, and voted to impeach Trump. Although in the first impeachment, it was entirely divided, along party lines. So this shows that something is now in the making. And this is not just in the political field, but also at the level of the business community, which has enormous influence over politics in the US, especially because they have now a great leeway to contribute to political action committees, what's called the PACs, the super PACs in the US. So we have seen almost half of the business community declare that they will no longer be making donations through these PACs, through these political action committees, to representatives and senators who have voted against certifying election results. This is quite a, I would say, rare and radical taking of position, a partisan position, by the American business community against elected officials of a certain political party. And the other half, which didn't want to take such a radical position, they simply decided to suspend donations to the entire elected officials of the politician class, basically, for 3 to 6 months or a year. So this again shows that the business community is, in one way or another, is also signaling its discontent. So this is, one could see this as the establishment kicking back, making a comeback And then we have also seen media and social media companies push back at an unprecedentedly radical level, meaning suspending Donald Trump's Twitter account or Facebook account, pushing some of the populist social media channels such as Parler out of platforms, out of Apple, out of Amazon's cloud, out of other platforms. And more importantly, now we see, I think, a strong commitment not only to just impeach Donald Trump, but also after Biden takes office, I think we will see a robust attempt to find the necessary 2/3 vote in the Senate, first to finalize impeachment, and then find the 51 votes, which is just a majority, a simple majority is enough there, to block him from holding public office for life. Now, this, of course, would have serious consequences for Trump and Trumpism. If he really still has ambitions, which we know he had before, to run again in 2024 and use the next 4 years to take over the Republican Party, to challenge all the mainstream candidates, Republican candidates at every single primary, to purge all the what one might consider center to center-right establishment Republicans. This project will face major challenges at this point. And to add to that, as I end this first part, we will, I think, definitely see, again, a robust campaign of legal prosecution against Trump for tax evasion, potentially for abuse of power, potentially for negligence, and all sorts of other infringements. And these could also include law cases against his inner circle, including family members, as well as political aides too. So that also might have a major impact on the future of US politics, because as we all know, litigation is an extremely time and resource heavy, demanding process in the US. And this could really take a lot of Trump's time and material resources away from other political activity as he focuses on saving himself out of either prison or significant financial punishments to come. And keep in mind, we also see a pushback from the finance community, as exemplified by the Deutsche Bank stating that they will no longer work with Trump providing financing to Trump projects. Or we have seen the prestigious PGA declaring that they are dropping Trump properties from their annual golf tour, which shows that the business community, which showed some close interest in Trump properties and businesses during his presidency, have now taken a radically opposite stance by blacklisting him and his businesses, by basically excluding him from their dealings. So overall, let me just conclude by saying that this will definitely, let's say, raise the possibility that establishment Republicans could take back the Republican Party from populists, although this is still very much up in the air. We shouldn't come to an easy conclusion, but definitely Trump now has a weaker hand compared to, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks ago. And when it comes to the Biden administration, they now have, on the one hand, a greater challenge in terms of addressing populism, polarization, and especially violent extremist populist trends. But at the same time, similar to establishment Republicans, they can now also enjoy broader societal support, broader business community support, broader the entire political elite support in terms of bringing normalcy, civility, and moderation to US politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for setting the stage for what we are going to expand on next. I think as far as it goes for the dark finale for Trump and his administration, the burden on the new administration, Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris, will not be an easy one. They are taking over with increasing loads over their shoulders, given the Capitol riots, and also the impeachment process, which I think is now, by all the measures and signs, will spill over to the post-January 20th days, which means a start by Biden administration will be a challenge, will be overfilled agenda. And that is perhaps why Biden is rather reluctant to support fully and actively and visibly a finalized impeachment process in order not to alienate the rivals, political rivals. But at one point, I think this is the challenge. But in other aspects, which I think brings us to the core of this subject that we are going to talk about next, is what the impact of the overall developments since early November, and in particular, the recent bloody Capitol riots and insurgency mean for Turkish-American relations. Some argue that this will make things even worse than they are. They are already bad, and they will make it already worse. And it will be perhaps leading us into a very dark, not dark, but perhaps more tense period, given also the fact that large part of the burden after the inauguration will be on the Justice Department. And it will not only be busy with restoration of the status of the American judiciary, but also has to deal with to restore its reputation as independent. And part of that work, of course, includes the challenges over the department during the Trump administration, with some elements stemming from Turkish-American relations, and specifically some cases there with the Iranian embargo, etc. So overall, to make the question short, what to expect on this part, on the impact of these events developing?
Now, let me begin with the Biden administration. And the challenge of dealing both with the fallout from Capitol riots, a really heavy domestic agenda, compounded by the COVID-19 crisis and the economic challenges. So that definitely is a heavy domestic portfolio, while at the same time trying to deal with a demanding foreign and security policy agenda, and Turkey being one of the key challengers alongside, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, and China. Now, an interesting comment on these issues came earlier today by Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, when asked about, tackling multiple challenges. She used the word multitasking. She said, that's why we have the word in the English language, multitasking, she said. And she was confident that the Senate could both impeach President Trump and confirm Biden's nominees, address COVID-19 and the economic challenge, and also, pursue foreign policy. So the Biden administration remains optimistic in multitasking, but at the same time, I can see that this will not be an easy feat, especially given the Turkish portfolio is not an easy portfolio. Now let's turn to how further complicated the Turkey portfolio has become during and following Capitol riots. Now Erdogan in quite an unprecedented manner, has been, let's say, has taken clear sides in US elections. Yes, in general, during earlier elections, either the Turkish American diaspora or the Turkish political establishment might have their favorites among candidates in various US elections, but there has never been, a clear and complete commitment to one candidate, to the extent that the Turkish government and its media outlets and its front organizations and think tanks were basically taking sides on the part of President Trump. And they were betting everything they had, all the capital, on what now turns out to be the wrong horse. So with the elections, it was not only Trump losing, but also the Erdogan government losing. What's more striking is the Erdogan government bet on the wrong horse again during the Capitol riots. And that, I think, is shocking. That shows how blind, how they're flying. That is, the Turkish Foreign Ministry issued one of the rare Schadenfreude messages among all, I would say the civilized, countries around the world. They were almost signaling that they're equal distance to the rioters versus elected officials. And TRT World, meanwhile, was interviewing Proud Boys, racist, populist, supremacist groups. So Turkey appeared to be, although, this is not the mainstream Turkish public, the Turkish government appeared to be an extension of these fringe, far-right, populist global movements, which are even now marginal within the Republican Party. And it was interesting that the Turkish government, that has really a horrible track record when it comes to propagating anti-Semitic conspiracies and racism, ended up siding with some of the worst forms of anti-Semitic and racist and white supremacist groups in the US. For those of you who watched Capitol riots, you might have seen these messages, banners, T-shirts, glorifying the Holocaust, either denying the Holocaust or glorifying the genocidal killing in Holocaust. And that's where the Turkish government ended up with. So that will be difficult to erase. That will be difficult to whitewash through lobbying attempts. Second, I think this will function as a wake-up call to those few optimists within the Biden administration, as well as the American political establishment, about Erdogan and his government's so-called reform agenda, as well as so-called rapprochement outreaches, to the US, to the European Union, to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt. There is a lot of empty talk about how Turkey is about to change track. Realists or pessimists like me, we only laughed when we heard these, reform plans. For us, this was simply a window dressing attempt by the Erdogan administration to avoid further European Union and United States sanctions, basically. But ultimately, now the damage has been done. And the Erdogan government not only will have a major problem with the Biden administration, but now with the Republican mainstream that is making a comeback. So Ankara's only ally at this point remains far-right populists. The fringe pro-Trump populists, some of whom have already been abandoned even by Trump himself. Because if you have been following Trump's latest comments, I think as a precaution against possible lawsuits and prosecution, he is trying to distance himself from the violent and extremist elements in this group.
Even as you mentioned, Aykan, just sorry to interrupt you there. I think you have people like Lindsey Graham and maybe Marco Rubio in mind, or am I mistaken?
I think what has been most striking of all these names is, because we only had 10 representatives vote for impeachment, but the undercurrent is even more important. So Senate Majority Leader, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who has, until the Capitol riots, defended Trump and basically pushed his agenda at the Senate and blocked many of the Democratic initiatives, have, first of all, leaked to the press through his aides and colleagues that he will decide on the impeachment vote based on the merits of the case. Mm-hmm. Now, that is almost equal to saying, I will vote to impeach Trump. Second, although he refused to convene the Senate now and postpone the impeachment vote until after the new Senate taking, the new term with the Biden term, that actually will help the impeachment case. When you think about it now, the Senate Majority Leader, who basically sets the agenda, the Senate agenda, is a Republican. But after Biden takes office, there will be a Democratic majority in Senate. It's a 50-50 divide, but Vice President Harris can cast the winning vote there when there's a tie. And so Democrats will be in charge of the Senate. And unlike today, they will only need to find 17 more votes, 17 defections from among the Republicans, and such as Mitch McConnell, the current majority leader, who might be the future minority leader in the Senate. So this, I think, changes the calculus, not only in US Congress, but definitely within the Republican Party, because my guess is, as the ship continues to sink, we will see further defections. We have seen press secretaries resign. We have seen high-rank officials across the US bureaucracy resign. We have seen even the First Lady's staff resign. And this is, to be frank, this might be quite unique this might be quite an outlier case. This mass exodus of close aides is an outlier case within US politics, but we know it's not an outlier development in authoritarian regimes, meaning when authoritarian leaders crumble, when the end is near, they are rapidly isolated. They realize that even their closest allies basically sell out. They desert. They flee the sinking ship. So this, I think, will be a major trend to come.
Going back to Ankara-Washington line again. This one, the behavioral pattern of Mr. Erdogan, who we know was delayed a long time before congratulating Joe Biden on his victory. And now also, as you described the pattern during the Capitol riots, both political power figures in Ankara and as well as the power-related media such as TRT. So this was apparently, as I understand from your presentation, noted well by the Biden administration. And what should have been done instead? What went wrong there? What should have been done in a way that it would at least be, albeit slightly, helpful to repair Turkish-American relations? What went wrong?
Maybe an easier question to answer is what went right. From A to Z, there have been so many mistakes. And also, let me also dwell on those mistakes a little, because, why have the Erdogan team, members of the Erdogan team, made so many back-to-back mistakes during the Trump era, in the run-up to the election, after the election, during the Capitol riots.
I had mainly post-election period.
Post-election, but this is, I think all of these this chain of mistakes results from, first of all, a complete hollowing out of Turkey's institutions. Meaning, when the Turkish foreign ministry is sidelined, when the Turkish bureaucracy, security bureaucracy is sidelined, when affairs are run by a narrow circle of yes men at the presidential palace around Erdogan, when you purge all the journalists to the extent that there are no more any, serious Turkish correspondents in Washington, when the Turkish ambassador in Washington starts acting as, the AKP province chair, Washington province chair, you block your channels to reliable assessment. And you begin to live in a parallel universe, in your alternative universe.
You become erratic, in short.
Yes, so that, I think, is the root cause of all these mistakes that we're seeing. And that this also, let's say, a reflection of this was, a very early interview whereby the Turkish foreign minister preferred a far-right publication, Breitbart, for its interview, going to the TRT world, interviewing Proud Boys, meaning, so this complete misreading of dynamics, being lost in short-termism, and basically being completely deaf to institutional warning signs. And in fact, even refusing to listen, to critical media, to seasoned diplomats, to critical think tanks and academia, brought Turkey to this, let's say, deadlock. And now there is a challenge that's also exogenous to Turkey. This is the endogenous challenge that I've been talking about. But there is also an exogenous challenge, and that is no foreign policy move or no bilateral relationship exists in a vacuum. Meaning, you are always in a playing field where there is some competition. And the moment the global community realized Biden is the victor, and in fact, in the run-up to the election, when they saw Biden has a chance of winning this, they started hedging, meaning they realized that Biden will have a much stronger emphasis on human rights and democracy issues compared to Trump. And they didn't want to be at the very bottom of this pecking order, meaning they didn't want to be the worst in terms of the rule of law, human rights, and so on and so forth in their relations with the United States. So in this race not to be the worst, it's interesting that Turkey is also the ultimate loser, meaning we have seen how the Gulf countries had this detente with Qatar. We have seen many semi-authoritarian regimes or flawed democracies starting to pay lip service to democracy and human rights. And of course, everyone is preparing for the Biden administration, just like everyone prepared for the Trump administration. When Trump administration put a strong emphasis on freedom of religion or belief, or on religious freedoms in the American parlance, we have seen around the world many governments invest resources and efforts into those initiatives. Because people adjust. They want to pursue cordial relations, and at the same time, they don't want to be the worst of the heap. They don't want to be at the very bottom. And interestingly, the Erdogan government failed to signal to Washington that they're not the worst. So at this point, from an economic perspective, from a foreign policy perspective, from a human rights perspective, strikingly, Turkey is almost always counted as one of the top 5 worst cases. And I'm not arguing this is an objective assessment. I'm more interested in perceptions. For example, when Pelosi speaks, the House Speaker Pelosi speaks about problem cases, she says Russia, China, Turkey, And so what I'm arguing is this is more important than objective facts. I know there are numerous indicators around the world which show that Turkey is doing really bad in terms of all these fields. But what is more important is when we see mainstream senior American policymakers referring to problem cases, they almost always count Turkey, whether they're Republican or they're Democrat. So this means the Biden administration, in trying to mend relations with Turkey, will now have to deal with not only this climate, anti-Turkey climate, anti-Erdogan climate within Washington, they also have to deal with a counterpart that played all its cards wrong. That definitely does not make Biden's task easy, because we have to realize that there are pragmatists. But Biden's government administration is a moderate government. There are numerous pragmatists who are not necessarily in the business of, let's say, punishing Turkey. They're looking for win-win solutions. They're looking for ways to mend ties, increase trade, roll back Turkey's acquisition of the S-400, find ways of bringing Turkey back into the transatlantic alliance, de-escalate tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. But now, even as I say these goals now, it sounds quite a fantasy, meaning already even before Biden took office, we have seen that this potential reform agenda today looks more impossible than ever.
Then you mentioned that you started to enter the regional context as well. Well, where Turkey is, let's put Turkey in the further into the regional context regarding the impact of the current events and also post-January 20 era. There have been some patterns seen since November. There was as Trump escalated and challenged the election results, there was quite a dark hole, globally speaking, a vacuum, which of course produced a lot of opportunities for all those regimes to fill in. And what we have seen was, I think, a mixture of both in terms of how Erdogan administration handled this vacuum. Partly it continued its forging relations with Azerbaijan, for example, whereas it fumbled a little bit regarding Eastern Mediterranean, but there is talk still, harsh rhetoric or let's say firm rhetoric, whichever you will, by North Cyprus about two-state solution on the island of Cyprus, and most recently announcement of the exploratory talks process between Turkey and Greece. So I think what we see is a mixed picture right now, and it's hard to figure out what to make of this and how it will impact on the upcoming patterns of the Joe Biden administration regarding Turkey's moves in regional context. What is your assessment about that?
Now, when it comes to regional dynamics, let me first approach the question from the Turkish perspective. I think the Erdogan government's initial tactic has been similar to what Gulf countries have been doing, try to at least push the narrative that Turkey is looking for rapprochement. We have seen this with Israel. We have seen some talk concerning Egypt, Saudi Arabia, some chatter maybe about the UAE, and also definitely the European Union. And so although there are no concrete steps, credible, legitimate concrete steps that make any of these discourses, any of the chatter plausible, at least the talk is still there. The reason I'm making a significant distinction between talk and action is this. Now, if you look at this issue from Ankara, there is a firm belief that Turkey has reached out to Israel. If you take a look at this from Jerusalem, the perception is that Turkey nominated a junior political appointee with no diplomatic experience, who is known for his anti-Semitic views and strongly anti-Israeli writings, as ambassador nominee to Israel. So when Israel looks at this, they don't necessarily see a rapprochement attempt. Or Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think they remain as critical as Turkey's support for the Muslim Brotherhood as they used to be before the latest talk of a potential détente. We can't even call it a rapprochement, but possibly a détente. So, or in the Eastern Med, yes, we now will have the 61st round of exploratory talks between Turkey and Greece. But let's take a look at what the Greek Foreign Minister Dendias said. He said, we do not mistake the Turkey today with the Turkey that we know from year 2000, which was interested in EU accession. In fact, he said, today's Turkey is even different from Turkey of 2016, 2015. So what appears as smart steps to mend ties and therefore signal to the Biden administration that Turkey is let's say, a source of stability and peace in the region. And when I say in the region, I talk from the Balkans to the Caucasus, from the Middle East to North Africa, or the East Mediterranean in general. That's not the perception either in Washington or in Brussels or in regional capitals. So the talk is not necessarily matched with action on the part of Turkey. When looking at it from the United States, the key question remains this. On the one hand, there is still a strong argument presented by, let's say, the few remaining Turkey friends, and that is Turkey is the great bulwark, the great guarantee against Russian and Iranian hegemonic ambitions in the region. And therefore, and Turkey, regardless of its descent into authoritarianism, plays this role, and therefore US cannot, or NATO cannot afford to lose Turkey and has to stick with Turkey. So this has been, let's say, a very important talking point, also pushed by Turkey's lobbyists, overt and covert lobbyists in Washington and in Brussels. Now, this sounds like a convincing argument, but the problem is, and it sounds reasonable as well, but the problem is Turkey, which used to be really the stronghold of NATO in its southeastern flank, has since been, for almost the entirety of the US political scene, now in collusion with Iran and Russia, meaning it's perceived to be enabling Russian and Iranian hegemonic ambitions, despite being on opposing sides with both Tehran and Moscow in theaters of action such as Syria, such as Libya. So I think the problem is that there is now an acute awareness that Erdogan finds ways, especially with Putin, to cut win-win deals, which reinforce Turkish and Russian footprint in Libya, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, at the expense of NATO presence and footprint. Now, this spoiler role that Ankara has been playing and will probably continue to play with, evading Iran sanctions, with evading US sanctions against Russia, with helping Venezuela evade US sanctions. So almost every theater of action has Erdogan either undermining US policy or NATO policy. So given this state of affairs, I think it will be very difficult for the Biden administration simply to use the logic that Turkey is a very important, bulwark against Russian and Iranian expansionism in the Middle East, and hence we should turn a blind eye to some of its transgressions, and we are forced to find ways to work with Turkey. I don't see that as now the dominant logic in Washington. Instead, I think the emerging new thinking in Washington is Erdogan, as long as Erdogan is in power, Turkey will continue to play a spoiler role within Europe, within NATO, within the Middle East, and therefore the Western alliance should find alternatives. We have seen that with now the increasing American cooperation with Greece and Cyprus, not just politically, but also militarily. We have seen this in the regional realignment. We have seen the UAE, Egypt, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, France coming together, even holding military exercises together in the Eastern Med. So I think what we are seeing is, and of course this can't happen overnight, but what we are seeing is a radical reshuffling of the alliance structure, not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in NATO's southeastern flank.
So this has to do with two keywords, perhaps, unreliability and unpredictability. That is basically seen through the lenses when those, especially Washington, looks at Ankara.
And if I may add just one sentence, I think we are now transitioning from unpredictability as a problem for Turkey to predictably colluding with adversaries stage, meaning the problem is no longer Erdogan's unpredictability. The problem is Erdogan now has a consistent pattern of playing a spoiler role and undermining the transatlantic alliance. And hence, I think that's even a worse problem for Turkey to overcome.
Soon we will have the questions, but you can start thinking about what questions you may want to ask to Aykan. But in relation to what you just said, there's another aspect, of course. The most recently, Minister of Defense of Turkey, former top general Hulusi Akar, has been speaking out, calling for the reversion or revision, rather, of the S-400 decision and sanctions on the American part, especially. And these, of course, is one part in what we can expect as part of the impact on the new administration over the regime in Ankara. And second one is, of course, the Halkbank case. I know both aspects, of course, require about 45 more minutes to deliberate on, but I think these should not be left unmentioned in this context. So please give us your brief about these two points.
I'll be very quick about these, but let me reflect on an earlier meeting today held by the Atlantic Council's Turkey branch, where former Syria envoy, Jim Jeffrey, who's known to be one of the most sympathetic names to Turkey and who's really admired in Turkey, was very clear. He said, I can't express how big of a deal the co-location of the S-400s and F-35s are. And he was even, a person who is perceived to be very pro-Turkey, was trying to make it clear to this audience, which involved many Turks, that you have to understand that this is really a red line for the US. Like, there is no way to lighten this issue. And I think in Ankara, there is still a difficulty in grasping that by co-locating, as Turkey wants, the S-400, the Russian air defense system, with the world's most expensive 5th generation stealth fighters, you're literally risking $1.5 trillion project. Meaning, if Russia collects digital, and radar signature of the stealth fighter through this co-location, It's basically all the countries involved in this consortium, almost 2 decades of investment and a $1.5 trillion project will basically go to waste. And it's really mind-boggling how the Erdogan government doesn't get why this is the case. Now, when it comes to the Halkbank issue, again, I think what the Erdogan government fails to realize is this. Over the years, numerous Western banks, both American and European banks, have been fined with massive fines, have been subjected to massive fines. For example, BNP Paribas, $8.9 billion fine for sanctions evasion and for infringements which were much less, let's put it this way,
breaches.
Not only breaches, but much less intentional. Sometimes they were simply financial wrongdoings. They were not grand conspiracies. They were not grand geopolitical conspiracies. Whereas the Halkbank case is really an outlier case. It's like a NATO ally, Turkey, devoting its second largest public lender to a systematic Iranian effort on Iran's payroll, directed by the Iranian regime to evade US sanctions for a nuclear project, for nuclear armament. Now, there is no way Erdogan can make this case go away. I know Trump was an outlier himself and gave the impression that there are ways to make this case go away. We now know through various exposés that there were attempts to provide kind of a non-prosecution agreement to Halkbank, to the individuals and entities involved in the sanctions evasion. And this was pressure put by Trump through the Attorney General on the Southern District of New York prosecutors. But to Erdogan's surprise, there is the rule of law and due process in the US, and the judiciary is independent. And there was pushback, and Trump failed. Trump's Attorney General failed. And the case is still there. And the case will come to a conclusion. And if the court finds Halkbank guilty, I think it's just realistic to expect a fine that equals the infringement, the transgression, because that has always been the case in earlier bank fines. The amount of evasion, sanctions evasion, or money laundering that financial institutions were involved in ended up being the fine plus a bit more. So these two issues are not going away. They will not be swept under the carpet, and there are no easy off-ramps if that's what Erdogan and the Turkish foreign minister and defense minister have in mind. I think the only real off-ramp is Turkey doing the right thing. That is, Turkey accepting culpability when it comes to Iran sanctions evasion and taking measures not to repeat it with Iran or with Venezuela or with Russia.
And admitting guilt in a way.
That's very important. Admitting guilt is very important. And second, when it comes to the S-400, I think the off-ramp is either returning it, I know, which is difficult, or relocating it elsewhere, which is probably not possible with Russian preconditions, or at least mothballing, what is called, you just lock it up, never to activate it again, with regular checks to basically reaffirm that it is deactivated. And then hopefully gradual reinsertion of Turkish companies into the F-35 supply chain, Turkey acquiring a NATO air defense system, and over time, then the lifting of CAATSA sanctions.
Probably if after leaving White House, Trump is going to be tried, one of the cases will most probably be the case related to his dealings about Halkbank through the Justice Department, etc. But also the important aspect, I think, is, and I want to hear your comment about that, is that in the new era, as Biden made it very clear, it will be very, very important to give Justice Department its long overdue independence, and widened, enhanced jurisdictional powers, and also reinstating and consolidating its damaged reputation and mode of activity, which means also that the courts such as the Southern District of Manhattan, for example, which was under pressure, especially on the case of Halkbank, will be even more untouchable in terms of political interference. So I want to hear, have you seen any signs of the realization of this new reality by the power figures in Ankara?
Now, let me begin by reminding our audience that when Biden was the vice president, and this is, by the way, available in White House records, Erdogan, in a private conversation, which has since been reported, tries to intervene in the legal proceedings, and Biden gives him a very clear answer and tells him, "I will be impeached if the executive intervenes in judicial affairs." So I think that's, first of all, a very clear sign where Biden stands. Not just on principle, we know that this is truly his values, but also he knows the consequences. He knows he will be impeached if the executive branch intervenes in the judicial affairs. That'll be the end of him. So my expectation is Biden will be hands off when it comes to Halkbank case, not just the ongoing case, but concerning other potential cases. Because what we have been hearing right from the very beginning of the Zarrab case, which then turned into the Mehmet Hakan Atilla case, is that this was not the only sealed indictment. And just to remind our audience, in the US case, these sensitive prosecution, the investigations, the indictments remain sealed until the suspect is in US jurisdiction. So when Zarrab landed in Miami, the indictment was unsealed and he was arrested. When Mehmet Hakan Atilla landed in New York, the indictment was unsealed and he was arrested. So what we have been hearing all along is that there are numerous other sealed indictments waiting for other suspects of the Iran sanctions evasion scheme.
Suspects of higher ranking?
Sorry? Yeah.
Suspects of higher ranking?
Possibly, given this was, because we now know very clearly that Iran's sanction evasion network in Turkey involved Turkey's top political and financial elite. So the inner circle of Erdogan. So if and when these other individuals are in US jurisdiction, we might then see further unsealing of indictments and further cases. So that I wouldn't find surprising. Second, now that the Southern District of New York no longer has to deal with thwarting Trump's pressure or the DOJ's, the Department of Justice's pressure, they can focus solely on the merits of the case, on this case as well as other cases. Because ultimately, we have to keep in mind, this is one of the busiest attorney generals, the prosecution teams in the US, because the Manhattan court, especially the Southern District of New York court, has almost all of the world's top financial corporate headquarters. So they deal with the world's largest cases. So they always have to pick and choose, right? They have bandwidth issues. But now that they can focus entirely on this case or on these cases, we can see further steps, I think. And keep in mind, there is also now another case at New York's Eastern District against Kuwait Türk Bank. And that one involves terrorism finance. There was an earlier case brought in California, which was found inadmissible. But this time, it's a much more solid case brought by a US citizen and his his widow and children who have legal standing before the court. So we might also expect some other cases going forward, some other, let's say, decisions and fines being issued. So bilateral relations will remain rocky, not just because of the existing number of disagreements and conflicts, but given the relationship has been full of landmines, meaning there were so many transgressions on the part of the Erdogan government. Now they are coming back to haunt him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions you have in mind, please send them, write them down and send them to us. And we are going to basically leave them to Aykan to respond. I think we have now about 20 minutes, 25 minutes left, Aykan. And another key question in general now is with the shape that events are taking in Washington, D.C., the loss of elections by Trump, and also his pattern of behavior ever since the election result has been made public, means that the populist leaders worldwide, across the world, have lost a role model, a very important, powerful role model as inspirational source, and an ally in terms of acting and ruling arbitrarily. Can we now say it's a rupture point in terms of the decline of populism now worldwide, or is it just a temporary phenomenon now? And does it mean that there will be another accumulation point further ahead for populists to make a comeback with vengeance? How can we see the future now with this? Because there is a lot of discussion now. Trump most probably is, to say simply, finished as a politician or a candidate for a new election. But the movement that bears his name, Trumpism, is also something that one has to consider. Can it come back? Can such movements make a comeback?
Thank you for this question, because this allows me to reflect on the title of our session. What comes after populism? Question mark. Now, that question in itself, I admit, is an overly optimistic question, because it assumes that now we are at a stage where, this is the post-populist stage. Now we're transitioning to a post-populist moment. And there, an important caveat is that populism has been with us for centuries, definitely since the 19th century, and populism is here to stay, possibly for centuries to come. But the optimism in my question is not that populism will disappear, but that it will wane, meaning it will recede from being the dominant political current in the United States, in Europe, or elsewhere in the world. So that is, let's say, that's still up in the air, but that is at least now a possibility, meaning maybe before Capitol riots, we had, let's say, a more pessimistic assessment about the longevity of this current populist wave. Whereas now, I think sometimes one symbolic event could be the trigger of a counter wave. And now I'm seeing some anti-populist counter wave. Now, this was evident also in the fact that Biden won. There were quite a number of skeptics within the US who didn't see the Biden-Harris ticket to be a plausible ticket, both for primaries within the Democratic Party and then for the elections, because they thought, both of them are very centrist candidates. They certainly cannot succeed within the Democratic Party, which was now really under the winds of change. There was really this grassroots, what some called left populist wind of change. But first of all, Biden and Harris succeeded within the Democratic Party, and then they won the elections. And now it seems the US political climate is also a quite centrist climate, or at least anti-populist climate. That is, I doubt anyone, either in the new administration or in the Republican establishment or among the business community, see the immediate future in the populist paradigm as imposed or pushed by Trump. So, of course, all of this is easier said than done, meaning let's not be simplistic. Let's not assume that just by blocking a few populist leaders, the wave can be overturned, or just by, let's say, impeaching Trump or banning him from office.
We have seen that in the latest Washington Post poll today. I think a lot of people, majority, is condemning or against the Trump's behavior during Capitol riots, but the lesser majority is about his impeachment. So that is one point. Second, I think counterpoint to what you have been saying is that anti-Semitism, white supremacy,
conspiracy theories,
xenophobia in Europe, anti-immigrant, etc. All of these elements are alive and well.
Definitely, they're alive and well. Conspiracy theories will continue to, I think, dominate the airwaves and social media. But ultimately, sure, structurally, the economic inequality and discontent, the new media environment, conspiracy theories, these are all structural reasons why populism is here to stay. But agency, I would argue, is as important as structure, meaning leadership matters, and in both senses, meaning a robust Trumpian presence would have mattered a lot for populism to succeed, just as a strong Biden leadership, Biden-Harris leadership, will also be, let's say, important in pushing back against populism. So definitely a lot of the dynamics, the root causes are here to stay. But at the same time, now we are seeing both structural and agency reasons why there can also be at least a successful battle against populism. And let's keep in mind, this is, when we say populism, I know we're conflating everything together, but this is at least populism 2.0, because populism 1.0, I would argue, had more to do with the initial transition to, mass media. And for example, the printing press, newspapers, dailies, radio, these were extremely important. For example, radio and the first, the motion pictures for Nazis, they were very important. And again, I strongly recommend the Pulitzer Prize winning novel, All the Light We Cannot See. The leitmotif in that novel by Anthony Doerr is radio, basically, radio and Nazism. That's not the main theme of the book, but that's the leitmotif of the novel. So now with Populism 2.0, we're talking about Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp groups. We're talking about, Parler. We're talking about maybe the next generation of alt-right social media platforms that we don't even yet know. Possibly there will be increasing segmentation, meaning many of us will live in the world of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, but then there will be this entirely disconnected conspiratorial populist group that exists in an entirely parallel universe of media, social media, and in-person interaction sphere. So that itself, of course, is extremely dangerous. Just very quickly, just 2 sentences. I know there are no quick fixes to this problem, but nevertheless, I would say that rather than just fighting the symptoms, we should, or rather than just pursuing a Kulturkampf, you know, with woke culture and cancelism and canceling populists, let's, I would say, look at the ways in which we can tackle precarity, you know, the precariousness of individuals in this new economy. Like one great approach is possibly a universal basic income. You know, that has now become much more plausible under COVID-19 because we're beginning to move toward there. So maybe ensuring a universal basic income to everyone globally, especially now in the West, where there are resources, could be a kind of a counter push to this age of precarity. And second is a kind of a lean but more effective welfare state, you know, increasing provision of education, healthcare, and housing services and other social services to address these anxieties. I think they are as important as suspending someone's account or kicking off an alternative social media platform or just, you know, canceling people we don't like.
Some questions, and we have about 12 minutes to go, so brief answers, if you will. Muhammad Al-Muhammad is asking, how do you foresee the Biden-Erdogan relationship over Turkish intervention to Syrian territories?
Now, that was, you know, Syria, and especially US cooperation with Syrian Democratic Forces, which is Syrian Kurdish YPG-led, has remained one of the key disagreements between Washington and Ankara, not only during the Trump era, but we also know that it had its roots during the Biden era. In fact, it's no coincidence that of all the names offered by Biden to take a role in his administration, Brett McGurk, you know, the envoy to, you know, for the coalition to fight ISIS, was the one that received the most, not only criticism, but insult from the Turkish press, basically. And that reflects Turkish anxieties about what the Biden administration might mean vis-a-vis Syria, because Trump, in a way, did accommodate Erdogan to some extent. You know, he did pull out some of the US forces out of Syria. He allowed 3 cross-border military operations, Turkish military operations into Syria. And it was only because of a strong bipartisan push in the US that Trump was not able to pull out fully and hand northern Syria completely over to Erdogan, which could have, of course, led to further ethnic cleansing, demographic engineering, and atrocities against the local ethnic and religious minorities, who also suffered enormously under the Assad regime, as well as then under ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates also funded by and supported by Turkey. So now I think in terms of the Biden administration's Syria policy, I do not expect a US pullout. I expect US to keep a deterrent force against Russian, the Assad regime, and Iranian presence in the region. The Biden administration, I think, will also send clear signals to Turkey by way of both messaging and keeping these potential sanctions in place to prevent a 4th major cross-border operation. They'll be committed to protecting the region's, Northeast Syria's vulnerable minorities. These include Kurds, Yazidis, Syriac Christians, Armenians, Protestant converts, and others, Chaldeans and others. So we know that Turkish troops and Turkey's Islamist proxies have been really brutal with vulnerable populations in this region. So I can't imagine the Biden administration affording new atrocities committed against these groups. It would be extremely delegitimizing and undermining for the Biden administration. Of course, these are not necessarily solutions, right? These potential pushback positions are just palliative approaches. What is needed is finding a sustainable solution to Turkish-American disagreements over Syria. And I think that can only happen through a return to the Kurdish peace process. I think the Biden administration, together with the European Union, in coordination with transatlantic allies, should put pressure on Turkey and the PKK and its affiliates for a return to the peace process, the Kurdish peace process. And this time around, it should be a holistic approach, not just Kurdish peace process within Turkey. There should also be efforts to reconcile different sides in Northeast Syria, the pro-KRG Kurds with the PYD Kurds and other groups in the region, and also bringing Northeast Syria's, political actors together with Turkey as well. So now I know this can sound too, let's say, utopian to our audience, but every time that criticism is hurled, I always take us back to February, March 2015. Right before the disastrous collapse of the Kurdish peace process, there was the Süleyman Shah operation, whereby Turkish troops, in coordination with YPG forces, carried out a military operation to relocate a very important, pre-Ottoman era tomb from the threat of the Islamic State. Now, I always take people back to that moment in history because it shows, first of all, there were times when Turkey saw Syrian Kurds not as a threat or not as terrorists, but as allies to work with even militarily. Second, when Turkey works with Syrian Kurds and others, there is only one loser: jihadists, the Islamic State. It's a win for Turkey. It's a win for Syria's vulnerable minorities. And therefore, it's a loss for Iran, Russia, and the Assad regime. So I think the US should not disregard the Kurdish issue as a marginal issue. I think the Biden administration should see the Kurdish peace process in this holistic fashion as really the golden key to unlock the Turkish impasse. And I think that's the way forward. I know that's just one, but possibly the most important component of a coherent Turkey policy, but definitely it should start there.
In terms of conjuncture in Ankara, how realistic this is, it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But thanks for this underlining. I think you also gave a response to the question by Megan Stanley. Konstantin Buhayer, I think we have about 5 minutes to go as far as it goes. For the sake of argument, I would like to mention Ankara succeeds perhaps to keep Turkey a key player. Victory in Nagorno-Karabakh, discovery of gas reserves in the Black Sea, ongoing reaffirmation of trade agreements with Britain, with more to come, forcing huge and unaffordable defense purchases on Greece from Israel and France in exchange for possibly temporary support, expanding diplomatic presence. How does this show of influence place Ankara in the forthcoming Biden administration? I think you went in and out of this subject, but please give a very brief take again.
Now, what Turkey calls assertive foreign policy is definitely perceived by Turkey's neighbors near and far as either irredentism or belligerence. And this, of course, is also observed very closely by the European Union and the United States, although we haven't necessarily seen an effective pushback policy so far. But one immediate consequence has been this regional, what I call alliance of the threatened. So all the regional actors which felt bullied by the Erdogan government in the absence of significant EU or US action, looked for ways of solidarity with other bullied actors. So like a decade ago, if I talked about the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, France, working together, I think it wouldn't have made any sense. In fact, it would have sounded quite crazy. But today, strikingly, Turkey has become, unintentionally, a push factor for regional realignment. In fact, we have seen some serious analysts, some high-profile analysts arguing during the Abraham Accords that what enabled Israel's rapprochement with a number of Arab majority countries was not just the threat of Iran or the incentives provided by the US, but also it was the threat of Turkey, and not Turkey, of course, Erdogan's Turkey. It's basically an Islamist Turkey. So Turkey will remain a shaping element in the region, shaping foreign and security policy. And definitely Washington and Brussels will pay attention to this. But this might not always be in the form of pushing back against Turkey or appeasing Turkey. Keep in mind, it can also be US and EU engagement with the regional actors who feel bullied, meaning there can be also more indirect ways in which the transatlantic alliance can engage with these neighboring countries.
With this, I think the time is up, and we have a couple of more questions, but I apologize for our participants not to be able to take them. Thank you, Aykan, for these thoughts and comments. Very valuable indeed on the subject, and very timely. And I think it will be a period which we will observe with full of excitement and anticipation, because there are lots of unknowns about this. Definitely a breaking point. A new era is unfolding in terms of many relations. Perhaps that's another subject for another talk, but perhaps the Cold War was dual polarity period. Perhaps we are seeing perhaps League of Democracies, that Biden's project, perhaps another Cold War dual polarity between democracies and populist autocratic regimes. We will see. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Center for Turkey Studies and all its volunteers and workers for making this possible. And also thank you a lot for the audience, spending a Friday afternoon or evening with these quite heavy subjects. I know it takes a lot of effort.
Before everyone leaves, it's as I mentioned, as it's time for family photo. Those who do not wish to be in that family photo, please shut down your cameras. Those who do wish to be, please remain so. So before we end, I think we will have this photo, and when done, I will be notified so I can close the session. Okay, it's done. Thank you everybody for your time, for your attention, for this valuable session. And we thank CEFTUS again for this opportunity, and see you all and meet you all in the next session. Have a good weekend.